On Friday, I spoke to on an immigration panel to young people doing a year of service with the Jewish organization Avodah. Though we were focused on immigration, upon hearing I'm a minister, one of the young people asked, "Is there a place to pair advocacy and social justice within religious tradition?" I chuckled a bit and I was like, yeah, it's called Middle Church, 50 East 7th Street. But seriously, I said, yes, absolutely. To which they then pushed a bit deeper. They're at that age where everything is a possibility, so earnest. And they said, but how? How do you do that? How do you do religion and justice and advocacy? Well, I said, you do it at 11:45 on Sundays, or whenever your place of worship gathers. This is our community organizing vehicle, right? This is where we come together to build relationships across difference. This is where we check in with one another, look at each other online or in the eye, touch, feel, re-regulate after a busy week. And to their question, perhaps most importantly, this is where we preach and teach, where we hold the text of the world, as Reverend Jackie teaches us, with the text of our lived experiences, and with the ancient texts, which we just read, to see what they are calling us to do today. And if we don't use this pulpit to advocate and speak out against injustice, moreover, to speak about God's justice, we have truly, as Reverend Jackie preached about last week, missed the mark. So may we be a place that strives always to not miss the mark in this regard. Yesterday, when my husband Graham asked me how the sermon was coming, yes, yesterday, I told him flat out that I don't really like this text. I don't like it because I don't think that many of us experience such exuberant moments in our lives, like a blinding light or seeing and hearing Jesus. So it feels a bit unrelatable. Further, I don't like it because it's hard to imagine the worst of the worst becoming the best of the best, right? It's hard to imagine 47 or Musk or anyone who kills, whether it be through policy or power, becoming a leading prophet for liberation, right? That's who Paul is. Like right up there with Kelly Brown Douglas or William Barber. I mean, it's difficult for my mind to go there. These ancient stories are swallowable when we keep them kind of like there. Yeah, we figure transformation can happen to anyone, but when we really think about that, it's hard. And that's what we have today, right? In this fairly familiar story, if you grew up in the church, Saul of Tarsus, a leading, well-known persecutor, murderer, killer of those who were following in the way, because Christians weren't a thing yet. On his way to Damascus to get legal permission to continue to kill is where we find Saul in this story, thinking he's living out his faith well, and he's suddenly confronted with a blinding light, a light that causes him to fall to the ground and shield his eyes. "Why are you hurting me?" Jesus asks. "Why are you hurting me?" the Palestinian child asks, as Hind Rajab did when her vehicle was shot 355 times by Israeli forces while she was waiting to be rescued. She would have turned 7 yesterday. "Why are you hurting me?" the black trans woman asks as she walks in fear of her life. "Why are you hurting me?" the partner in an abusive relationship asks as they dodge emotional or physical harm. "Why are you hurting me?" Mother Earth asks as we continue to erode our natural resources and very source of life. "Why are you hurting me?" the non-binary person asks when they receive back their passport, not reflecting who they are. Why are you hurting me, Saul? Jesus asks, in a question that demonstrates the epitome of vulnerability. In hurting oppressed people, Saul hurts Jesus, which we know in turn hurts God. And wherever something or someone is harmed, God's own self is harmed. Why are you hurting me? We ask on behalf of our country crumbling in what sense of democracy we have left. Friends, what is significant for us, as much as we may or may not like this text, is that Jesus' vulnerability turns out to be a tool of transformation that not only stops Saul in his tracks, but it reverses the entire trajectory of his life. Did we know vulnerability has that power? How often are we vulnerable with ourselves or with those whom we are closest to, or with those in power? Jesus' question, why are you hurting me, of course, doesn't really have a good answer, right? Like, what could Saul say here? I thought this is what you wanted me to do, like kill tons of people. No, there's actually not a good answer here, and Jesus knows that. But perhaps the best thing that happened, the best thing that can and should happen when we are confronted with fundamental questions as to why we do the things we do, vulnerable questions that shake us to our core, is that we just might stop. Back in early March, you helped send me on a continuing education trip to Montgomery, Alabama, to learn alongside Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams and Dr. Resma Menachem. Thank you. I gathered with a multi-ethnic group from all over the country to experience Reverend Angel's Healing Race Portal. Majora Carter has also done that. Designed to happen at sites of deep racial trauma, like Montgomery, Alabama, site of the port where the largest number of enslaved people in America came through to be walked up Market Street and sold. During one of Dr. Resma's sessions, he taught us that whenever we feel a gnawing, that is an inner wrestling, this inner instinct that something just isn't right, we stop and we tend to it. And we tend to it for as long as it takes, without knowing why or what the outcome will be. We tend to this gnawing, undefinable as it may be, so that we become familiar enough so that we can return to it. Are you following? We tend to it because the gnawing, he says, is literally our humanity. In her book, Radical Dharma, Reverend Angel chimes in. With all due respect to Gandhi, she says, we can no longer afford to just be the change. We actually have to be the transformation, which is to say, we have to transcend the form, the construct we find ourselves in. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. For 3 days he was without sight and neither ate nor drank. That's all we're told about how Saul, now Paul, spent these 3 days after seeing and hearing the resurrected Christ. But I think I do know what he did. I think he stopped and tended to the gnawing. In Montgomery, Reverend Angel further taught that we have such gnawings because we know in our being, in our very core, that freedom is our essential nature. And whenever and wherever we are not free, we're gonna gnaw. We're not gonna feel right. And whenever and wherever we're not free, we will grow. Saul, though he was dramatically visited by a God who chooses when to call, when to tap, when to move us, because of God's choosing, not ours, tended to his gnawing for freedom, ultimately realizing that his way of being wasn't getting anybody free. At Middle, I think we can sometimes swing a little too far in our focus on the collective and on community, right? I can. That's all good and necessary, but the truth is, transformation must start where? Within. We need to orient from within, right here, rather than to what's coming at us. Because what's coming at us is toxic as hell, right? It's a world programmed with ills and sins from the beginning of this nation, ills of land theft and white body supremacy, deceit, and empire. We can't possibly transform society if we are orienting ourselves outwardly. So we have to start here. The place of knowing that we are rooted in abundance, possibility, love, and freedom. That is our birthright. That is our call. This has to be the place of our source of motivation and our beginning of change. And whenever these birthrights are threatened, we're gonna gnaw. We're gonna tend to that, and then we can move from here to here. When we start to realize this, Reverend Angel says again, neither the path solely of inward-looking liberation nor the pursuit of externalized social liberation prevails. Rather, a third space, as yet unknown, emerges, and it is a radical dharma, and it is ours. End of quote. What happened to Saul when he stopped? He transformed, which led to a revolution of society as Saul, now Paul, became arguably one of the most prominent missionaries and apostles in the entire Bible. So what might happen to us? What might happen if we believe that God still has the power and is still breaking through ordinary paths, ordinary days, stopping us to tend to the gnawing of our ultimate right to freedom? This text, like it or not, has power, because we know the way that it translates to us doesn't have to be a carbon copy. Most of us, perhaps none of us, are never going to fall to the ground losing sight as God speaks to us. But if that happens to you, please tell me. Even still, we know that God is still speaking, right? We know that God is still stopping us. Who might we become? We, no matter what we have done, none of us are too far from the possibility of transformation. Because you see, we don't have to worry about how someone is transformed, or who might be transformed, or when. That is up to God. All we have to do is stop and tend. And here's where the community part comes in, because it is absolutely part of it. When we tend to ourselves, we become so magnetic and so contagious that we give others permission to tend to themselves too. We don't fix anybody but ourselves, but we are showing how it's done. Jasmine Sadula says, it is not enough to know that we want freedom. We have to practice it. Knowing we want freedom is a practice in presence, not fortune telling, not storytelling, presence. Breaking cycles of violence involves vulnerability. And as we see here, vulnerability affords transformation. And what does transformation afford? Revolution. And I don't need to tell you or remind you that we need a revolution, right? Of values, of social order, of spirit, of bodies. We can march, write, call, and give as much as we want, but revolution will not come without transformation. And when it happens to us, no matter how painful it might be, it can completely transform our lives and our relationships if we let it. It can resurrect us if we stop and tend to the gnawing for freedom, we will be so transformed that revolution is possible. So much so, friends, that the next 100 days, rather than rife with fear-mongering, xenophobia, divisiveness, executive order after executive order that kills and diminishes life in all her forms, we might have flourishing. We might have planting and growing and dancing and evolving and sharing and redistributing and singing and building and dreaming, rather than a racist white woman who calls a young black boy an expletive, raising thousands of hundreds of dollars. We're gonna raise thousands for NPR and the Kennedy Center and Sesame Street and our own free arts program in Brooklyn, Moliere in the Park, who lost their funding yesterday, friends. Because what does vulnerability afford? Transformation. And what does transformation afford? Revolution. We can do this. It is not too far out of our reach. Something has changed within us. Something is not the same. It's time to trust our instincts, to close our eyes and leap. Amen.